In 1830, the world's first railway commuters glimpsed a faster future, where life would never be the same. They were passing through an area that had exploded onto the map. It was a new kind of society. In the previous 100 years, Britain had gone mad for buying and selling. This was the first high-production, high-consumption economy. Once it had been started, there was no stopping it. Visitors were amazed by the scale of the changes.
It is impossible to behold this without being convinced that whatever other nations may do, they will never equal England in respect of manufacture. Vast bellows give roaring blasts, which make the whole edifice horribly sublime. I thought that I was gazing into the mouth of Dante's hell. It's in a spot like this that one sees the sources of British power.
This was the beginning of industry. People's lives would be changed forever. The question is, why did it start in Britain? This is the puzzle that is facing our 5 investigators. They meet in Cambridge to pool their knowledge. They are trying to solve the riddle of the origin of the modern world. Eventually, their investigations will follow a chain of chance and circumstance that will take them back 10,000 years. The complete story will cover all parts of the world. But for now, there is a more local question. Why did the Industrial Revolution happen in Britain and not one of her European neighbours? Countries like France and Germany weren't so very different after all.
Go back to 1730, look at France in comparison with England. There doesn't to any intents and purposes seem to be any reason why you would pick England, especially the Midlands and the northwest of England, over what was called then the great nation, France.
For instance, someone who took the rocket as the symbol of success for the Industrial Revolution might well observe that the key thing about it was the mechanics, the systems of gears and levers that drive it. And that's what's really new. Now, if you looked for the origins of mechanisms like that in the previous century, you'd be most likely to find them in France. In 1730, you would find them in the ingenuity of the craftsmen who made automata, machines that mimicked animal and human actions. These machines were exhibited for an eager, paying public. They were even shown to royalty, and those who made them gained fame and fortune. The greatest of the automaton makers was a man named Jacques de Vaucanson. His most famous work was an automatic duck, lifelike and fully working down to the last detail. David's secret is making a copy of the duck. He's being financed by an eccentric Belgian collector on the condition that he will never make a second one.
So the whole cycle is that the wings open, come forward, go back, fold up.
That's right, and the whole body rears up like that.
And the tail feathers display?
Yes, the tail feathers come up like that. And then, of course, he also feeds. In the original description, as you know, is that he actually feeds from the bowl, and then processes digestion, he defecates with a horrible smell, so it was said. It almost certainly was a trick. Anyway, we're going to use a trick, got to do that as well.
What sort of trick do you have in mind?
Well, actually, I'm going to blow bubbles up through the bowl and have some sort of wadge come up from underneath him rather than going through the body, which I think is there's so much going on that nobody's going to notice anyway.
What's been the most difficult part of the
I think the wings,
body?
the wings, which are not completed. That, after 6 months of lots of little pieces of blank paper, and finally came up with that one. And that does appear to work. This is, as I say, just a boxwood mock-up of the final thing.
This is all going to be metal?
This will all be in copper. He spent hours dissecting the ducks and all the rest of it. And I've got some horrifying photographs of ducks' wings, you know, all cut up and all the. It's amazing that
you've got real ducks.
Oh yeah, I've got real ducks' wings. They're beautiful things, aren't they?
Yeah.
That colouring. Horrifying to think one actually eats chicken wings, and they're the most superb pieces of mechanism. You know, the muscles and.
So you think God was a very good engineer?
I think he was. You've got to hand it to him. But, just how he managed that one, I'll never know.
When Vaucanson first comes to Paris from Grenoble in the late 1720s, early 1730s, I think he turns to build the flute player and the drummer and above all this duck, mainly for cash and to show that he's a virtuoso. And of course it works triumphantly because he is a virtuoso.
For all the real skill involved in its making, the duck and other automata were to remain in the world of entertainment. They won their inventor's celebrity in the courts and salons of 18th century Europe, but they were not the direct ancestors of the rocket.
So I think if you're trying to explain what's special in any way about the English situation just before the great automation of the second half of the 18th century, it's not a very good idea to look at superior English artisan skill or the presence of more engineers or something like that. I don't think that's the key.
Jacques de Vaucanson's work with mechanical animals was to involve him in an early attempt to industrialize France. It happened when the king made him head of French silk production. He threw himself into the work and came up with a plan to reorganize the industry on factory lines. The factory that Vaucanson planned was going to be a control freak's heaven. He would decide exactly where they would work, where they would live, and how much they were paid. He would decide how much the woven silk should be sold for and who it would be sold to. Best of all, the whole project had the authority of the king himself. It couldn't fail. Vaucanson invited the weavers and merchants of Lyon to come and see his plans. They didn't like it at all. Weavers didn't like it, and neither did the merchants. After thinking about it for a while, the people of Lyon rioted for 3 days.
Vaucanson has to get out of town in a hurry. He manages to escape at night, dressed as a monk. His mill is burnt down, his machines are broken, state support is withdrawn. Towards the end of his life, 1760s, 1770s, he sets up a few silk factories down in the south of France, in the area of Ardèche, on enlightened, rational lines, as he sees it, with machines that are obviously going to throw lots of people out of work and make silk in relatively large quantities. What you see is a rational, planned, absolutely sensible, and in the end, rather ineffective system of automation and industrial change.
The presumption in Britain is first and foremost that an innovation is supposed to make money. It's supposed to be commercialized.
Yes.
In France, nobody is averse to money in any society that I know of. But in France, innovations are first and foremost supposed to serve the state. They are geared toward the military, and what's not useful to the military can be used to entertain, particularly the upper class. There you have Simon's duck again and so on. In Britain, it's supposed first and foremost to make money.
The social structure within which innovations occur is absolutely essential. The great difference seems to be most continental countries have very stratified systems whereby most of these innovations occur at the top and most of the work remains there, doesn't spread out sideways. In fact, real effective industrial change was already happening back in England. Not by royal decree, but because of a lucky combination of circumstances. There was a valley in Shropshire where coal and iron happened to lie side by side under the ground. That's how Coalbrookdale got its name, and it was there that Abraham Darby moved during the reign of Queen Anne. Abraham Darby made iron pots for a living. He hadn't been appointed by the government. He was a member of the radical religious sect sometimes known as the Quakers. That is why there are no pictures of Abraham Darby. He and his friends believed that portraits were part of the vanity of the material world, which is ironic, because what he did do was to put Britain on the road to being the first industrial consumer society. Abraham Darby developed a simple trick. He started to melt his iron using coke instead of coal. Coke is coal which has been specially treated. The impurities have been slowly burned out. The result is that coke burns hotter, and a hotter furnace produces more molten iron. Darby had come to Coalbrookdale to visit his Quaker relatives, who were in the brass business. They already used coke to fire their furnaces. Darby converted one of their furnaces to melt the iron for his pots. And that is how it started, with people making a lot of very simple things out of iron. It didn't involve clever machines or even organized factories. What was happening here was mucky, simple-minded, and repetitive. Darby's new coke furnaces could produce molten iron to make enough pots for everybody in England. Anything at all could be made simply and in quantity. Iron became the plastic of the age. But what came first were Abraham Darby's iron pots. Where once a village craftsman had made a couple of pots a year, Darby's foundry was now producing thousands. He became so rich, he bought the valley of Coalbrookdale, but more importantly, he had taken the first step on Britain's road to the consumer world. Every manufactured object, anything turned out in bulk in a factory, anything made repetitively and sold in quantity, every consumer object has its origins in part with the good Quaker of Coalbrookdale. The process which Abraham Darby had started now began to take off. A decade after his first experiments with coke smelting, 120 new iron foundries were supplying 90% of Britain's iron. People began to realize that industrialization also makes deep changes to society.
As far as the eye could see, the country was blackened by smoke.
A dense, pestilential cloud hangs over it, blackening even the grain that grows upon it. I thought of the price we had to pay for our vaunted supremacy in the manufacture of iron. But oh, how wretched the mortals that grind out their destiny there.
At night, the whole region burns like a volcano spitting fire from 1,000 tubes of brick.
It may be fanciful, but when you look at these black buildings and you look at the smoke coming out of the roof and you think of the black iron and you think of the black coal, you suddenly begin to see why this is called the Black Country, why there are black sauces here, why the costume of the Victorians became black, their funerals were black, their top hats were black, everything became black.
coal and iron, and people who knew how to use them. These things combined with the public eager to buy the new manufactured consumer goods. By the 1750s, there were plenty of entrepreneurs ready to exploit that unique combination of circumstances in a way that would change the world. The consumer revolution took off in Britain in the 1750s. What had started with ironware very soon spread into Chinaware. The desire for China exploded. Once it had been a luxury of the super rich, imported from halfway across the world. Now it became the backbone of British manufacturing. But again, the question is, why Britain? The key innovation was learning how to make porcelain, the hard white china whose recipe was a closely guarded secret of the Chinese. That problem had been solved 30 years earlier in Germany, in the city of Meissen.
This was the place where we see the first European production of porcelain. And the Europeans had been searching for the way to make porcelain for centuries.
The problem had been solved at about the same time as Abraham Darby was starting to smelt his iron. The discovery was made by a man who spent almost all of his life as a prisoner. Johann Butger, in his youth, had claimed he was able to transmute base metals into gold. When rising politician Augustus the Strong heard about that, he was delighted. He abducted Butger immediately, locked him up, and set him to work. Butger was a talented and intelligent experimenter, but even so, the transmuting aspect of his work didn't make much progress. Augustus became angry, and in order to save his own life, Butger started on a much more successful sideline. He discovered how to make porcelain. This wasn't gold, but it was nearly as good. Porcelain was desired as a status object by royalty all over Europe, but only the Chinese knew how to make it, and they charged top prices, payable in silver only. The porcelain factory at Meissen soon became world famous, but this wasn't mass production. A single Meissen figure was built, assembled, and finished from hundreds of pieces. Craftsmen might work on it for months. Far from undercutting the Chinese, one figure could cost as much as 1,000 imported Chinese plates.
These model figurines that Meissen became very famous for, they replaced the figurines made in sugar that were used to decorate the dessert tables of the great banquets.
For all the success of its porcelain, the area around Meissen did not see the rapid growth that happened in the British Midlands. A Meissen figure was too expensive for almost anybody but royalty to buy.
It was sold at extremely high prices. It was a rarity. It was a high luxury good, and it never moved beyond that.
In England, the situation was very different. Josiah Wedgwood set out to do for China what Abraham Darby had done for iron. Wedgwood lived in the emerging Midlands, where he could develop his factory techniques unhampered by the guilds and established practices. But what fueled Wedgwood's contribution to the Industrial Revolution wasn't manufacture, it was the creation of desire. Wedgwood was able to understand that luxuries weren't just for the rich, luxuries were for the people.
It is absolutely necessary to show our various table and dessert services. These articles must every few days be so altered, reversed and transformed as to render the whole a new scene.
He made china for royalty, but then he used his flair for marketing. He produced affordable imitations, stacked him high and sold him relatively cheaply,
It is really amazing how rapidly the use of this cream colour, alias queensware, has spread almost over the whole globe, and how universally it is liked.
Wedgwood offered free delivery, free replacement of breakages, and a money-back guarantee if not satisfied. Not far from Meissen, there is a house which is a monument to Wedgwood's ability. In 1770, Prince Leopold Friedrich Franz filled it entirely with Wedgwood china that he had bought by mail order.
Why did he collect all this Wedgwood and not Meissen, which is surely only 100 miles down the road?
Meissen porcelain stand for an old time.
So it was old-fashioned by this stage.
Old-fashioned, and Meissen produced, yeah, I think it is so, only for the
so
courts.
Why didn't Meissen change its style?
They cannot. They produce in this porcelain only,
yes,
and sell the porcelain, yes, to the courts,
yes,
and not to the middle class.
Yes, yes.
Wedgwood was
yes,
clever,
yes,
produced for the upper class,
yes,
also, and for the middle class. I think it's modern thinking,
yes,
of a potter.
Right. Yes.
And some persons in the 18th century mean that Wedgwood was a better merchant than a potter.
Ah. The British became really good at making wonderful modern imitations of European and Oriental luxuries.
And actually, of course, we have seen other countries do that in this century. If you look at Japan, for instance, the story you've told, putting other goods in the place of Wedgwood's products, would actually have suited Japan very well indeed. So this is a strategy that countries that perceive themselves at first to be almost economically marginal in the world context move themselves to the centre of a world market. Britain succeeded in doing that.
The best example perhaps of all of this is the cotton industry, which becomes the pivotal industry of the Industrial Revolution.
Cotton dresses made from fabric exported from India had taken the world by storm. These fabrics were as popular in Istanbul as they were in Barnsley. The village weavers in India stepped up production until they could be made so cheaply that ordinary people could afford several dresses. The trouble was that they became so popular that the makers of woolen garments managed to get a law introduced banning them. It became obvious to some British manufacturers that they could cash in. They knew from the performance of Indian cotton that there was a ready-made market. Eventually, the ban was lifted. Now there was only one thing holding it back. Turning cotton or wool into thread by twisting it on a spindle had been the traditional activity of the virtuous, domesticated woman since before the ancient Greeks. It was the power of entrepreneurial opportunity that changed all that. One woman, however virtuous, can only make so much thread on one spindle. James Hargreaves reasoned that productivity could be increased by putting several spindles together. The importance of the machine he had invented, the spinning jenny, was so quickly recognized that its export was immediately banned. In the 1780s, Hargreaves managed to set up a factory of 10 machines with 10 spindles each. But this didn't happen without a struggle.
Hargreaves had to flee and eventually gets adopted by knitting manufacturers in Nottingham, where he has to be protected in what was called a factory safe. The windows were all blocked up on the lower floors, and he was virtually a prisoner in these large-scale workshops, which were an early form of factory.
The idea of a machine that spins thread was taken up by Richard Arkwright. He was an aggressive entrepreneur who saw the huge potential of factories and wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. He got his hands on a patent for a water-powered spinning machine and set up in business. In 1773, his first factory was employing 600 people, most of them children. Whenever he came up against resistance, which like Vaucanson and Hargreaves he did, he just moved his operation to a less militant area. He would only grant patent licenses to those who were going to set up on a factory scale. The individual spinner was now out of the picture. This was the beginning of the age of the factory. Many followed Arkwright. Wedgwood himself soon started mass-producing china.
Why was it possible for this to happen in Britain and not in France? People have been searching for the cause of the Industrial Revolution in England for a very long time, and many people have despaired of finding it, and they've always said there is this X factor, this special factor. Now, none of us believe that the British were in any way superior in intelligence or in any other respect. Perhaps, however, there's something special about the way their society is organized. I think there is one aspect of British life that may help to explain it. And possibly this X factor is a peculiar English invention, the English club. Now, what could be the relationship between a club and an industrial revolution? What is the link between them? These clubs solved a problem which you have when you're trying to construct an industrial revolution, so to speak. What you really need, therefore, is to try and get a balance between two human tendencies. One is to be very individualistic, to lock yourself up into your private world, to read, to think, and to develop new ideas. The other is to be very friendly and cooperative and collaborative. Now, if you spend your whole time drinking and chatting to people, you won't get anywhere. If you spend your whole time as an individual, locked up in your own world, you won't get anywhere. So the club provided the ideal place where you could combine these two things. You could combine them because you had an excuse to combine them. And you'd sit round, relax, and talk every evening to your friends. Now, this would mean that people who normally would never meet, businessmen, craftsmen, academics, all these people who lived in separate worlds could come together and join in conversation. Without it, I cannot see how you could have had either a scientific or an industrial revolution on this funny little island. In France, on the other hand, clubs were seen as a threat to the state. A place where people gathered to talk might be a place where they plotted against the king. Just before the revolution, a French aristocrat who visited London got a shock when he went for a walk in St. James's Park.
It is a strange sight to see the flower of the nobility mingling in confusion with the vilest populace. Such is the taste of the English. It is part of what they call their liberty. Every man has the right to discuss freely. The king himself is not safe from censure.
I'm sure there's a lot to be gained with all this discussions that's taking place. You can't tell me that the people who were actually working the machines and working on the technology were a member of any of those clubs. The artisans, the people with the technical skills were not part of these groups.
People who were designing the machines, Watt, James Watt, Matthew Boulton, Wedgwood, they were all members of the Lunar Society, for example.
Yes,
and
true.
So they were designing the machines, but admittedly the poor person who was sweating on the machine certainly wouldn't have been a member of, I agree with you.
But no, my point is not that they were just, these aren't just factory fodder, just sort of being told what to do. many of these people were actually in the process of developing the technology itself.
If we think about, you know, polite St. James's West End clubland alone, we would make the mistake that you rightly point to. But if we extend that to understand a wider form of sociability amongst all artisans, I think that story's actually got a lot going for it.
What is really interesting is just how quickly those networks of knowledge spread.
Absolutely.
That someone like Bolton or Wedgwood or whatever, they knew exactly who was the guy who was the best person at gilding this little piece, or who could make this precise piece of instrument, and they would send their things all over the country.
The network of entrepreneurs and inventors was a unique feature of British society. But one more idea was needed to take Britain into the era of the rocket. And it actually was made by a group of people sitting and talking in a club. The right combination of things made the Industrial Revolution start. The will to make money, a population eager and able to buy factory-made goods. By the 1780s, there had already been huge changes. There were 50 cotton mills in the Manchester area. But that was nothing. 40 years later, there were 800. What extra element had been added to cause the final explosion of the Industrial Revolution?
Good way of getting at the puzzle is to think about the kinds of devices that were being built at this time and what they were used for. The reason why these things became so popular, they were shown at fairs, but they were also shown to the king. They made Vaucanson a lot of money, and eventually he sold out his models to a clever team of English entrepreneurs who put them on show at the Theatre Royal in the Haymarket. The reason why they were so popular was, I think, because they capture a fundamental element of what's happening in early 18th century northwestern Europe, which is the idea that machines can be thought of in roughly the same way as we think of living beings, and that living beings can be thought of in roughly the same way as we think of machines.
30 years after the Duck, in the 1780s, Europe was astounded by a touring exhibition of a life-sized automaton. It was claimed that it was a machine that could play chess. It produced in its 18th century audience a mixture of contempt, fear, and admiration.
It seems to be a thing absolutely impossible that any mechanism should exert the intelligence of a reasoning agent.
Fashionable society was ready to believe that it was looking at a thinking machine. But in fact, there was a man inside pulling the strings. It would be 2 decades before the truth was uncovered. But by then, the myth of the chess player was to make its own special contribution. It happens in 1784 in a club where Edmund Cartwright, a clergyman poet from Oxford, finds himself having dinner with some of the new industrialists. The entrepreneurs are trying to deal with a problem. It's now so easy to spin thread in quantity that their warehouses are filling up with it. There is so much of it that it's being dumped abroad at knockdown prices. The problem is at the weaving stage. Spinning was easy to mechanize, but they don't see how the same thing can be done for weaving. It's complicated and it seems to require human judgment. But Edmund Cartwright has just heard about the chess player. With the confidence that only comes from real ignorance, he announces that if a machine can be made to play chess, it can certainly be made to weave cloth.
2, 3, 4.
What's remarkable about this machine is its extraordinary ingenuity in turning each and every component of the weaving process into something that a mechanical device can do. Human capacities are systematically remodeled and replaced by machinery. For example, if you look at this moving arm here, it's called a picking stick. What it's doing precisely is mechanizing one of the most skilled jobs of the whole cotton process, which is to pick cotton thread as it moves backwards and forwards along the shuttle. So what's the connection between machines like this and other automata? Well, it seems to me that what we see here is the almost complete automation of human capacity. The machine often goes wrong, though. The thread breaks unless it's kept damp. It needs a lot of maintenance and care. And I think there's the key to the problems and opportunities of mechanization in the Industrial Revolution.
You've worked on machines like this. What's your experience of tending a number of machines?
When you get a set of 10 of these, to keep them going all day.
So it was one man like yourself looking after 10?
10, all women.
Yeah.
It slowly but surely come more women than men on weaving side. But there was skill in it. You can't just put any Tom, Dick and Harry on these looms, else they're going to get something trapped.
Right.
This mill will run on water.
Right.
So of course, if you had a decrease in water flow, your looms would run slightly slower.
So that was a seasonal thing?
That was a seasonal thing, and then that meant the workers had to work longer. For the first fortnight, when you went out to the mill at night, people sounded as though they were talking from a long, long way away, as though they were whispering.
Yeah.
And then after a fortnight, it was as though your ears were beginning to adjust, then you were all right. But what you don't realise is slowly but surely you're going deaf.
You're going deaf.
Yeah, and I now wear a hearing aid.
Yeah.
Because when I watch it tell you, I can't hear it.
Yeah.
When you first started at mill, the old blokes would come down and say, watch out for the old spinsters when you leant over at loom or else they'll have you.
1, 2, 1. 2, 1.
A large number of people working with machines were now going to be understood as though they were machines.
2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
The automaton became a way of representing how humans worked.
1.
In France and in Britain, especially in the industrial areas, the human body is increasingly understood as a type of machine. And the labour force is increasingly understood as automotive, disciplined, functioning like clockwork.
1, 2, 1, 2.
Now, with the addition of automation, the age of the factory really did take off. By 1815, there were upwards of 3,000 power looms operating in Manchester alone. The new cities sucked population into them. But what did this do to the weavers, whose colleagues in Lyon had rioted a lifetime ago?
By far the greatest number of weavers were employed in cotton, and they were the ones that took the brunt of this first really major technological transformation that changed the lives of a whole domestic workforce. We can see that there were over 250,000 handloom weavers working in the cotton industry. Within 20 years, their numbers were reduced to less than 50,000, and they too disappeared in the next 10 years. There was very good reason for this Luddism we all hear about and the resistance to machinery at the time. The mechanization of weaving was a source of enormous public debate in the early 19th century. Though there were calls for a tax on machinery, though there were calls for a minimum wage, though there were calls for providing some form of an early form of unemployment compensation, nothing was ever done to provide this. And it does seem that there was enough confidence in the power of the state to contain social protest at the time.
Across the Channel, in the France of Louis XVI, things had not been quite so well controlled.
Such enormous power, constantly acting, and from which no man was free, must, in the nature of things, degenerate into absolute tyranny.
In a society that actively discourages interaction between the classes, resentment is liable to build up unnoticed. As Arthur Young found out when he visited France in the months before the Revolution.
The abuses were heavy and universal. What must have been the state of the poor people, paying heavy taxes from which the nobility and clergy were exempted?
With hindsight, it should have been obvious that the people who had resisted Monsieur de Vaucanson's factory were likely to take matters into their own hands. The French Revolution shook the world in 1789. It gave way to the empire of Napoleon Bonaparte.
It should be borne in mind that the sort of heyday of the Industrial Revolution coincide with what's known as in Britain as the French and Napoleonic Wars, which cost Britain an enormous amount of money, even though there was no direct fighting on British soil. But the British national debt went to, multiplied by a factor of something like 100 during these wars.
We've had income tax ever since.
And no, not quite. It was immediately abolished after the wars, and then brought back in 1856. But if you're looking at Britain compared to the European continent, where not only that they had to pay taxes, but they also had fighting on their soil, and then it probably increased the gap, even so it slowed both of them down.
But couldn't you also turn the argument around and say the capacity of Britain to beat Napoleon depends on the strength of its economy? Napoleon tried to put a squeeze on Britain's vital trade. The country could use its economic power to ride out the blockade, but only if it could keep its trade routes open. The success of the navy became all important. The eventual naval victory over the French at Trafalgar remains in the national consciousness to this day. The British victory in the Napoleonic War, I think, owed less to the bulldog spirit and far more to technology and taxes. The extraordinarily efficient British tax system, which relied on the knowledge of the whole British economy, meant that the British government could raise vast quantities of cash, both to pay foreign armies and also to build its own war machine. And the technology which counted was naval technology. The government set up a committee of philosophers and scientists to streamline the naval dockyards at Portsmouth. They turned it into the largest factory in the world. In 1799, the need to produce standardized parts for naval repairs gave rise to the world's first production line. Instead of 100 skilled workmen, 10 relatively unskilled laborers working at almost 50 different specific machines could produce on a mass scale hundreds of thousands of objects like these, wooden pulley blocks on which the navigability of Admiral Nelson's fleet relied. Woodcutting was the key technique of the new engineering system, and instead of the old pit saws, which used the labor of two very strong, very skillful men, they had a steam engine whose power would be delivered throughout the works by these belts. This one turns a big circular saw against this great log of wood. It's lignum vitae, the wood of life, imported to Portsmouth from Central America or the West Indies. An extraordinarily hard and reliable wood, but hard to cut purely by hand. The problem with it was that because of the unevenness of hardness, it would easily deform from a perfect circle into some kind of ellipse. Instead, here, you could turn the log directly against the circular saw, producing these beautifully engineered, extremely precise blocks with a fine grain, great hardness, and durability. Precision engineering with replaceable parts. That was the key to the success of the Portsmouth system. The great victory at Trafalgar in 1805 depended explicitly on the application of industrial principles to mechanized naval warfare.
So when Napoleon called the English a nation of shopkeepers, he was actually pointing to a reason for his own defeat. It was the new British consumer society that allowed her to keep fighting through the French economic sanctions. The rocket made its journey only 15 years after the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo. The consumer society was now poised to spread so successfully that one day the same hamburgers and the same trainers would be available in every city on the planet. The world had taken off. On the 100-year timescale, the Industrial Revolution is a story of machines, clubs, and factories. But there is a further puzzle if we go back 250 years to find out what led to this. One more element was needed to make it all happen. The very global trade network that Napoleon had tried to destroy. Why did the growth of exploration and the opening of trade routes affect the Industrial Revolution? And how did Northern Europe, and Britain in particular, manage to come to rule the waves?